We have covered a number of scenarios in this module and a parametric and nonparametric test for each of those scenarios. We haven't spent much time talking about how to decide between choosing a parametric and nonparametric test. So now let's try and cover the rest of the story. Having discussed the details of these tests using specific case illustrations, let's now step back and talk for a few minutes about the broader context of formulating a statistical analysis strategy for a clinical research study. It's generally not practical to proceed outcome by outcome and hypothesis by hypothesis through a study protocol, choosing to analyze this outcome using a parametric test and that hypothesis using a nonparametric test. Instead, the decision to use parametric or nonparametric analytic approaches should be incorporated into the broader statistical analysis strategy for the entire protocol. In order to do this, we need to be clear about the advantages and disadvantages of parametric and nonparametric tests and be aware of the specific circumstances when the decision is or is not critical to the results of the test. The advantages of nonparametric tests are clear. They don't require the assumption of sampling from a Gaussian population and so can be used when the validity of that assumption is questionable or suspect. What are some of the disadvantages? 1. Nonparametric tests are less powerful when the data are truly sampled from a Gaussian distribution. Practically, this means that using a parametric test when the data are Gaussian will yield smaller p-values and tighter confidence intervals than a comparable nonparametric test. 2. Many statistical software packages don't calculate and report confidence intervals for nonparametric tests. As we have seen with analysis of variance, this limits the quality of information provided by the test and the resulting ability to make clear clinical interpretations. Of course, this is not an issue with StatCrunch. With the exception of the Kruskal-Wallis test, StatCrunch provides comparable results for all of the nonparametric tests we have covered in this module. Another issue is that nonparametric tests are not readily extended to multivariable linear regression models, which we will briefly introduce in a later module. Standard linear regression modeling relies on the Gaussian assumption that the parametric tests we have discussed in this module rely on. While there are nonparametric regression modeling approaches, they are complicated and generally don't yield the same quality of results that standard linear regression modeling does. Thus, if the ultimate goal of the broader statistical analysis plan involves multivariable linear regression modeling, it makes sense to restrict the analysis plan to include only parametric testing approaches. Both within the statistical community and the broader clinical research community, you will encounter a good deal of disagreement and a variety of opinions regarding when and how to make the decision between parametric and nonparametric tests. First and foremost, we feel that it's important to avoid automating this decision, primarily because it is a complicated and difficult decision to make. The decision requires careful deliberation and consideration of the context of the research project, the discipline area in which the research is being conducted, the design of the study, and the overall goal of the statistical analysis plan for the study. Ultimately, this decision should be discussed and agreed upon by the research team with input from the clinical investigator and the statistical co-investigator prior to the collection of data. Another important question to consider when choosing between parametric and nonparametric tests is whether or not there are situations when the decision is more important or less important. The table shown here is recreated from our textbook and comes from Chapter 41 on nonparametric methods. It provides guidance about when the decision between parametric and nonparametric is critical and non-critical. The table considers whether or not the population distribution is Gaussian or not, and whether or not the samples being analyzed are small or large, and discusses the impact of the various tests under each circumstance. Here are the takeaway messages. First and foremost, small samples are problematic, and the decision whether to use parametric or nonparametric is important. If the samples are small and the population distribution is known to be Gaussian, then using a parametric test will be more powerful and will result in smaller p-values. Nonparametric tests lack power in this situation. If the samples are small and the population distribution is unknown, there really is no easy solution, and context becomes critical. When the samples are large, the decision between parametric and nonparametric is less critical, and the power differential between the two is usually small. And that's the rest of the story.